All rise. Vojevoda.
Molim, ustanite.
Please be seated.
Thank you, Honours. Just for your Honours' information, we should finish within the hour. The fourth part of the defence case will examine in detail the creation of the JATD in the fall of 1993. During spring 1991, Stanišić was tasked by the Minister of Interior to create an anti-terrorist unit, which he began the process in October of 1991. As the evidence shows, this was abandoned in spring of 1992. In August of 1993, Stanišić began the process again, and over 1993 and 1994 created an anti-terrorist unit. The prosecution alleges that Stanišić created the unit in May 1991, and the unit was merely formalized, their words, in August of 1993. As the defense will show through the evidence of RJS 12, a witness who was involved in the creation of the JATD in 1993, the proposition that this was a mere formalization of an existing unit is plainly wrong. As your Honours have already heard during this presentation, in 1994, during the creation of the JATD, Stanišić authorized an inquiry into the history of the Red Berets. Simatović conducted that inquiry, and as I've discussed, it revealed the fragmentation of the nascent unit. As I discussed earlier, 9 units appear to have emerged in Croatia alone. We don't know from the prosecution case whether it is alleged that all of these were formalized or not. The prosecution case deftly sidesteps the inconvenience of these issues. RJS 12 will testify to the steps that Simatović and others took to build a lawful unit. This was no process of formalization or otherwise validation of an existing situation. The act of systematization, which was designed to give birth to the JATD, noted that the JATD would consist of only 40 operatives. Of course, if this was formalization of a collection of units or of an existing unit, it is strange that this number was so small. Prosecution witness RFJ 150 confirmed that, quote, the background checks to join the JATD unit were very stringent, close quote. They included a check for criminal convictions, even for traffic violations, an inquiry into general reputation, mental and physical health examinations, and an interview by a hiring commission or admissions panel. As RJS 12 will testify, only at the final stage was Stanišić involved. The commission would supervise the range of checks and then make recommendations that, aside from any obvious irregularity, then the Chief of Service would approve. RJS 12 will explain that the JATD had certain organizational problems because of the long delays occasioned by operative checks. The rigors of these processes, as RJS 12 will testify, tells its own eloquent story about the integrity of the process and the fact that what was being created was a new unit. Why should Stanišić, who, according to the prosecution case, had operated with brutal efficiency throughout 1991 and 1992 with his unit, then go through the trouble of this process? What was the benefit? For a cautious man leading a secret organization, it seems like the most curious of steps. When Milosevic and Belgrade, as the defense case will discuss, were seeking to persuade the international community that they had no involvement in Bosnia, with international sanctions ongoing and posing an existential threat to Milosevic's administration, why would he take that risk of formalizing a unit which thus far had operated under the cover of the conflict? What is also most curious in this regard is that Stanišić required checks of all potential recruits, which in the end included Božović, Crnogorac, Mijović, Subotić, Pupovac, Rajic, the very men the prosecution say he'd been working with hand in glove since 1991. Slide 20, not to be shown to the public, shows the results of operative checks into Božović. We accept that legitimate questions arise as to how some of these men ended up being accepted into the unit's reserve forces. It is obvious that in light of their criminal past, they should not have been engaged. However, as RJS 12 will confirm, these choices or their conduct should not be blamed on Stanišić. Admission into the JATD, whether the active or reserve forces, was possible following completion of the secondary school of the interior or by way of recommendation from someone within the service. If DB or MUP officials ensured their associates or friends were engaged, overriding the checks that Stanišić put in place, that is their responsibility, not Stanisić's. As the evidence will show, Stanišić did not have a role to play in the process of selection or engagement of any of the reserve forces. These types of engagements were not within his job description. Reserve engagements fell to his subordinates, not him. Those involved in the command of the JATD and other operational parts of the service determined whether additional forces were required, and it was their responsibility to select them from reserve forces lists. Conversely, as RJS 12 will confirm, Topalčević, the deputy of the service, played a more hands-on role. He was directly in charge of implementing special operations in emergencies and imminent threats of war. He was responsible for ensuring the finances and logistical supply of any special action. If Božović, Mijović, or any other reserve force, or any other employee for that matter, was engaged by the JATD or the later JSO, they would be expected to report to Topalčević before, during, and after any special action. The final part of our defense concerns 1993 to 1995. It concerns Stanisić's involvement in security and humanitarian missions, some of which took him into Bosnia. As slide 21 shows, these operations and humanitarian missions, which we will discuss, and that took place from 1993 to 1995, and which involved the Milosevic government, including the Serbian MUP, and on occasion Stanišić himself, include the following. First of all, the Serbian MUP's collaboration with the VJ, VRS, and the RS MUP in the joint headquarters in Banja Basta in 1993. Second, Stanisić's involvement in PAUK, 1994. And finally, the Serbian MUP and Stanisić's involvement in Bosnia and in SPWS in 1995. None of these three operations can be understood properly without reference to the Belgrade Serbs' pursuit of peace in Bosnia from late 1992 onwards. These operations took place in the context of a Belgrade policy that was pressing the Bosnian Serbs to sign a variety of peace agreements that began in late 1992 with the Vance-Owen peace plan and culminated in Dayton in 1995. These operations took place in that context, and these operations were legitimate security or humanitarian operations, even if, as is plain, some of the men involved committed crimes. The fact that some men committed crimes, and horrendous ones at that, does not speak to the prosecution's fiction that all Serbian action during the conflict was aligned and criminal. That proposition has been rejected on several occasions over the last 25 years by the ICTY. There is a plethora of evidence that suggests that Milosevic was never a supporter of the Greater Serbian project, nor any of the Croatian or Bosnian strategic goals. But even if Your Honours do not accept that proposition, there is no doubt in this case and other cases throughout the ICTY's history that Belgrade's policy in 1993 to 1995 was to end the war in Bosnia. Sir Ivor Roberts, the UK's ambassador in Belgrade from March of 1994 until 1998, will give evidence for the defence. He is patently no adherent to the Serbian cause, nor a fan of Milosevic. He does, however, care about the truth and the historical record. He will confirm efforts made by the Belgrade Serbs, including Milosevic, to end the war. This section of the defence case does not endeavour to change history's perception of Milosevic as a peacemaker, or present him as a peacemaker, or certainly not excuse him for crimes. He was no democrat or peacemaker by instinct. However, for a variety of mainly selfish motives, he sought a pragmatic end to the war. And he worked cooperatively from 1993 at the very latest with the international community to achieve peace. Ultimately, he prevailed. This was evident to defence witness Sir Ivor Roberts, who noted that by the time the Dayton, or will note that by the time the Dayton Accords were negotiated, Milosevic had successfully coerced the Bosnian Serbs into succeeding him their negotiating rights. This did not come easily. At a 29th of August 1995 meeting, Milosevic requested that Karadzic sign the contact group plan for peace, another request to Karadzic. An agreement was then reached where Milosevic had negotiating power on behalf of the Bosnian Serbs. According to Sir Ivor Roberts, quote, "It is fair to say that if the Bosnian Serbs had been able to exercise a veto, there would have been no agreement at Dayton," close quote. The prosecution will counter, arguing that if Milosevic was really pressing for peace, why did he continue to authorize, through Perisic and the VJ, logistical assistance for the Bosnian Serbs? The prosecution will argue that these actions show that his support for peace was illusory and his contribution to crimes continued. The defense case will expose the fragility of this argument. Sir Ivor Roberts will testify to Milosevic's carrot and stick approach to coercing the Bosnian Serbs to the peace table. That approach involved the provision of limited supplies in exchange for compliance in relation to peace agreements. As Milosevic noted at a Supreme Defense Council meeting on the 9th of December 1994, Perisic would be permitted to equip the VRS, quote, as soon as he persuades Mladic to accept the contact group peace plan, close quote. This assistance provided by Milosevic, which was plainly ever decreasing until it was finally cut off, was produced from the horns of an obvious dilemma. Provide logistical assistance and risk prolonging the war, or stop completely and see the RSK and the RS administration collapse with terrible consequences for all. First of all, Milosevic and the Belgrade Serbs knew that if the Muslim-Croat coalition was successful in Bosnia, in their combat activities throughout this period, the change on the ground would make it less likely that the Bosnian Serbs would have signed any peace agreement. Secondly, and decisively, a collapse of the Croatian and Bosnian Serb administrations threatened at best a humanitarian and refugee disaster, and at worst, a civil war in Serbia. This is not an exaggeration. The threats resulting from a combination of thousands of fleeing and radicalized fighters, opposition parties with armed paramilitaries, and an anticipated 300,000 to 400,000 refugees was obvious, and it cannot be overstated. Understanding the Belgrade Serbs' wholesale rejection of the warmongering of the Croatian Serbs in early 1992 under the Vance Plan, and the Bosnian Serbs in late 1992 under the Vance-Owen Plan, is the starting point for understanding Stanisić's actions from early 1992 in Croatia and throughout 1993 to 1995 in Bosnia. Of course, Stanišić had on occasion to be involved in any response. Such crisis, such attempts by the Belgrade Serbs to coerce the Bosnian Serbs and the Croatian Serbs to the peace table directly engaged his security obligations. As noted, there are several operations that must be seen through the lens of this analysis. The first relates to the Serbian MUP's collaboration with the VJ, VRS, and the RS MUP in the joint headquarters at Banja Basta in 1993. prosecution alleges that in early 1993, Stanišić, Simatović, and other JCE members sent Serb forces into eastern Bosnia along the Drina for ethnic cleansing operations, including Operation Udar, one of a series of operations implementing Directive 4. They allege that Simatović and the unit, under the command of Stanišić, formed camps in Bratunac, Skalani, and Mount Taura, and those trained forces destroyed non-Serb areas across eastern Bosnia, forcing their populations to flee towards the Muslim enclaves of Srebrenica, Gorazi, and Zepa. Your Honours will find that at the prosecution's pre-trial brief, paragraph 85. As the defence will show, whatever the truth of any of these allegations, none of them had anything to do with Stanišić. There is some evidence that Bozovic and Mijovic created an ad hoc unit in 1993, and they reported to someone in the DB. The handful of reports can be found in the personnel files. There is no evidence that they reported to or had anything to do with Stanišić. What the evidence does show is that this unit and other similar units were created in 1993 and were subordinated to the Military and Police Joint Command on Taura, the Joint Staff. That is not to argue that the Joint Staff was set up for criminal purposes, even if it was used by some to advance crimes. The Joint Staff was created in response to Oric's murderous attacks on hundreds of Serbian villages along the Drina River. Prosecution witness Milovanovic, VRS Chief of Staff, confirmed that in 1992, as 91 villages were completely destroyed, 3,200 civilians were killed, and 20,000 fled to Serbia. The problems at the border around Taura escalated in 1993 as Oric's forces began destroying more villages along the Drina River. Even though, once again, the prosecution case is empty of any recognition of these crimes, there is no doubt about their occurrence. Their witnesses and our witnesses agree. There is also no doubt, we suggest, about the security implications for Serbia, as these attacks took place directly on the side of the Drina across from Serbia, with mortar and artillery fire raining down on villages in Serbia and threats to important installations which would have caused humanitarian disasters. Serbia was entitled to defend itself. Prosecution must not be permitted to suggest otherwise, nor must they be allowed to conflate legitimate action designed to protect civilians with the butchery of Mladic's actions during operations such as Operation Udar. Thus, a joint staff was created, and it involved the Serbian MUP and the VJ in Banja Basta, the Serbian side. It commanded and coordinated the activities in the whole crisis area along the border of the Drina River. The focus was to protect Serbian villages and to allow thousands of refugees to return home. RJS 14, a retired senior police officer, will testify to the existence of the joint staff. Banja, not Stanišić, was in charge of the MUP involvement. Obrad Stevanović was the direct commander, answerable to Banja. Banja answered to Sokolović, the Minister of Interior of Serbia. And as confirmed by evidence in this trial from a statement from I'm pausing, I don't know whether it's confidential. As confirmed by evidence in this case, Banja also set up a training centre for the public securities police forces who were being called upon to deal with an enhanced role during the terror operations. Everyone from the MUP or the DB operating in these security missions reported to that chain of command. That chain of command did not include Stanišić. There is already incontrovertible evidence that all the combat operations that emanated from the Joint Staff, including all the alleged Serbian MUP units, Bozovic's in Skalani, Mijovic's Bratanac, Red Berets, were subordinated to MICT-15-96-T TG1. He was in charge of the VJ collaboration, or to the Serbian MUP, that is, Banja and Sokolović. The defence case will highlight that evidence and adduce further evidence to show that the Serbian public security, subordinated to the Joint Staff, commanded these units, which were police units, not DB units. If anyone from the Serbian MUP or the Serbian DB was involved in Operation Udar in February 1993 to forcibly transfer or deport the Muslim civilian population from eastern Bosnia, their units, their crimes cannot fairly be laid at Stanisić's door. He wasn't there, he wasn't in the chain of command, he didn't even know about those units. The second part of the final part of the defence case involves Stanisić's involvement in PAOK in 1994. It is entirely unjust for the prosecution to attempt to criminalise PAOK. This was a humanitarian mission that was designed to protect tens of thousands of Muslim civilians, the victims of violence between the forces of Fikret Abdić on the one hand and the psychopathic forces of the Fifth Corps and their band of jihadists on the other. We suggest that to deny otherwise is to close your eyes to the suffering of up to 100,000 civilians. The motive for the PAOK operation was to ensure that Abdić recovered his territory and to free those civilians from the arms of the Fifth Corps. It was transparently not in furtherance of crime. It was transparently not in furtherance of any of the Bosnian Serb strategic objectives. There can be no presumption arising from Stanisić's involvement in the PAOK operation other than he was involved in a humanitarian operation. RJS 6, RJS 12 and RJS 13 will discuss the build-up to and the execution of Operation PAOK and the command. Stanisić's role was as some kind of emissary, helping to liaise between Belgrade and PAOK. It was transparently not a command and control function. The defence case will urge Your Honours to examine this operation, and particularly the alleged role of Stanišić in organising combatants for the purposes of this operation. As the defence case will show, the evidence of his role in this operation shows that he is telling the truth when he says he had no unit DB or otherwise, at his command, even in 1994, late 1994, when PAUK began, other than a small, newly operational JATD unit. In particular, alongside the evidence of RJ6, RJS6, RJS12 and RJS13, for the moment we urge Your Honours to look at the Mladić diaries. Stanišić attended a meeting with Mladić and Milosevic on the 7th of October 1994 with a view to organising help for Abdić's civilians. Milosevic made a suggestion that Stanišić should send his forces to help. Stanišić's responses are summed up on slide 22. Providing a critical insight into Stanisić's lack of men, he suggests first that men from the VRS should be sent. When Čeliketic rejects this idea, saying he is very much against having men from the VRS engage away from their zone, Stanišić then falls back on another suggestion, quote, "I will collect men from all over. I will ask that Fikret Abdić pays them." One would have thought that Stanišić would have simply answered, "I will send the Red Beret unit. I will send the unit." After all, according to the prosecution case, that unit had been working hand in glove with Mladić and the VRS since early 1992. Dubois, Bosanski Samac, Divic, and so on, all the way through to the tower operations in 1993. And yet, he decides or suggests instead that he will collect men from all over. As we will show in the defence case, Stanišić did send his forces, 30 to 40 active members of the JATD, to provide security, reconnaissance and surveillance, and to gather intelligence. That appears to be the sum total of unit resources at his disposal. Finally, the last part of the defence case will look at what happened in 1995, and in particular the Serbian MUP and Stanisić's involvement in Bosnia and in the SPWS in 1995. The final part of the defence case concerns the Croatians' ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of civilians, Serbian civilians, during Operation Storm, and hundreds of thousands of civilians, Serbian civilians, during operations in Banja Luka. As long predicted by the Belgrade Serbs, the collapse of the Croatian Serb and the Bosnian Serb administrations led to a humanitarian and security crisis. The final part of the defence will explain what the Serbian MUP did to defend against these massacres, including trying to prevent the wholesale collapse of the Croatian Serb and Bosnian Serb administrations. Milosevic, as the evidence will show, was under heavy international sanctions and was reluctant, therefore, to send in the VJ. He was warned not to send in the VJ by international actors. He called upon Banja's 30,000 MUP forces to coordinate other ad hoc forces, such as the Scorpions. There is no evidence that Banja turned to Stanišić for assistance, and there's no evidence that the Scorpions or Arkan were under Stanisić's command. Once again, rather than base their case on the reality of this context, which is indisputable, the prosecution have shifted their case and distort the facts. Slide 23 shows a comparison of their case in Bosnia in 1995 from the first trial and now the retrial. As is plain, whereas once they at least accepted that the Banja Luka operations encompassing Sanski Most, Mrkonjić Grad, Kluč and Prijedor were designed to prevent the fall of Banja Luka, now they claim, paragraph 89 of their current pre-trial brief, that the Serbian MUP was acting with other Serb forces to drive out the remaining non-Serbs. Prosecution's change of case is deliberate, but it's also instructive. It's an attempt to squeeze defensive action into their ill-conceived joint criminal enterprise. It risks depriving the historical record of a record that reflects hundreds of thousands of Serb victims and their cruel ejection from Bosnia. It deprives the victims of justice and the truth. The Belgrade government was not only right to send in support to assist in those operations, it had a moral duty to do so. Indeed, as the defense case will show, they could have done more given the scale of the humanitarian crisis. RJS 14, the senior police officer I mentioned earlier who will testify about the tower operations, will also testify about the deployment of Serbian MUP officers to Bosnia to replace the Croatian and Bosnian police so that they could go to the front lines in order to support the combat. As with the tower operations, fast forward to 1995, the principal players from the Serbian MUP was not the DB unit, it was the Serbian MUP and their 30,000 armed police officers. As our JS-14 will explain, Stanišić was not involved in these deployments, even if he was responsible for the JATD's presence in SPWS in 1995, which played a very similar role. As with the Joint Command in Banja Basta in 1993, Obrad Stevanović, Banja, Sokolović were in command. RJS-14 knows this. He received his orders from this chain of command. Banja wanted to show that Serbia supported the beleaguered citizenry in both Croatia and Bosnia. He sent the Serbian police under government instruction. In Bosnia, they went there in their normal uniforms and with their normal PGM ranks. They did not participate in armed operations. Indeed, upon arrival in Bosnia, the 400 Serbian MUP officers were resubordinated to the RS MUP and its chief in Banja Luka, Pečanić. They reported to the local RS MUP and on occasion to Banja in Belgrade. The Serbian public security paid RJS-14. No joint operations with the VRS were conducted. Their duties, as I've outlined, encompassed regular crime prevention work. The prosecution makes much of the fact that 7 out of the 300 of Arkan's men who went to Banja Luka at the same time were paid per diems by someone in the DB. It shouldn't have happened. However, the preponderance of the prosecution's own witnesses support the account that Arkan's men were subordinated to the RS MUP. The payment of 7 of 300 of Arkan's men cannot change that evidence, nor the conclusions to draw from it. As RJS 14 will explain, Arkan was neither subordinated to the Serbian MUP nor the DB. And so finally, the defense case will explain Stanisić's roles in these operations. Your Honours will recall that according to the prosecution case, in 1995, Stanišić had been in command of Arkan, the Scorpions, and the Red Berets for 5 long, bloody years, deploying them into the war zones to train thousands of men and lead ethnic cleansing military operations. If that's right, he was one of the most brutal men with one of the most brutal missions. And yet, even the most perfunctory review of the documentation from this period, which we will lead and which has already been led, shows this characterization to be nothing but fabrication. Slide 24 shows a section of the Mladić diaries. On the 22nd of September 1995, Božović arrives with Filipović into Bosnia, or certainly into a meeting with Mladić. Instead of being recognized as the commander of the famous Red Berets, they're identified as a team from the Serbian DB. It's strange that Mladić does not immediately recognize Božović as the commander of the Stanisić's Red Berets that had contributed so much to the VRS operations. Why does he characterize them as a team from the DB? A question to arise from the prosecution's case is, where is the Red Beret unit that not only had shown itself to be so capable previously, which was absolutely necessary to help the collapse of the Bosnian Serb administrations? Even stranger still is what Stanišić says 1 week later to Mladić. As slide 25 shows, on the 30th of September 1995, Stanišić meets Mladić and is complaining. Mladić writes that Stanišić stated the following about Sanski Most. Quote, "There is no command there, political conflicts, cities are falling, Arkan embedded himself there, we sent 400 people. As far as I have been informed, this helped at Sanski Most and Novigrad." This may be one of the most telling pieces of evidence in this case. First, it shows that Stanišić was not involved in any meaningful way in the 1995 operations, as he states, as far as he has been informed. As the defense evidence will show in this phase of the defense case, Stanišić was involved elsewhere, rescuing hundreds of UNPROFOR hostages, securing the release of French pilots and a journalist whose lives were threatened by Karadzic and Mladić. More significantly, despite Stanišić creating, organizing, and commanding Arkan for 5 years, over thousands of square kilometers, and repeatedly in coordination with the VRS, not a single person attributes Arkan to the Serbian DB. Instead, as this section of the Mladić diary shows, Stanišić disavows Arkan completely, comparing his presence to political conflicts and cities falling. As he notes, Arkan embedded himself there. Why would Stanišić say that? He's talking to Mladić. According to the prosecution case, Mladić knows, he must know, Stanišić has been in command of Arkan for 5 years. But no, Arkan embedded himself there. That alone casts a reasonable doubt over much of the prosecution case. The remainder of the defence case will leave Your Honours in no doubt whatsoever that Mr Stanišić should once again be acquitted. Your Honours, our first witness will be RJS02, and he will begin the phase of our defence, which deals with Stanišić and the DB, designed to serve and secure Serbia rather than wage war in the republics. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Jordash. You've indicated the identity of your first witness. When would he be appearing?
Unfortunately, and I can only apologise for this, but unfortunately the permissions from the Serbian government are going to, with some certainty, be issued this Thursday when the Serbian Parliament sits. Therefore, we haven't been able to call a witness this week. The first, as you've heard, the first, I think, 3 witnesses are from the Serbian DB, and they all require permission to testify. So with Your Honour's permission, we will call our first witness next Tuesday. And with Your Honour's permission, that will be, I think this has already been granted, but by video link.
Thank you, Mr. Jordash. If there are no other matters that need our attention, we will now rise and take the adjournment to reconvene. We will reconvene on today week at the usual 9:30.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.